Something shifted in California this year, and most people didn't notice until the numbers started coming in. In-N-Out Burger, a company that's been synonymous with the state for over 70 years, has been quietly pulling back from California in ways that don't make headlines, but show up in corporate filings, employment data, and real estate transactions. This isn't about one restaurant closing or a symbolic move. It's about a business model that was built entirely around California, deciding that staying doesn't make sense anymore. And when you look at what drove that decision, you start seeing a pattern that goes far beyond burgers. Rising operational costs, regulatory changes that make expansion nearly impossible, and a tax environment that punishes growth. These aren't just challenges for In-N-Out, they're conditions that dozens of other major employers are quietly navigating right now. The state's economy isn't collapsing overnight, but the foundation is shifting in ways that deserve serious attention, because what happens in California tends to signal where the rest of the country is heading. The first time people really started paying attention was back in 2023, when In-N-Out announced it was closing its only location in Oakland. The company didn't sugarcoat it. They said crime had made it impossible to safely operate the restaurant and that protecting their employees mattered more than keeping that particular store open. It was a rare moment of corporate honesty, and it caught people off guard because In-N-Out doesn't usually make public statements like that. They're known for being quiet, family-owned, and fiercely loyal to California. So when they walked away from a location, it wasn't just another business decision. It felt like a line had been crossed. But that Oakland closure wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of something much larger that had been building for years. Around the same time, In-N-Out moved its corporate headquarters out of California entirely. They relocated to Tennessee, taking with them not just office space, but jobs, tax revenue, and a symbolic piece of California's identity. The company framed it as a straightforward business move, citing better conditions for growth and operations. They didn't trash California in the press. They didn't need to. The move spoke for itself, and that's what made it so unsettling. When a company that was born in Baldwin Park in 1948, that grew up alongside the state's post-war boom, that became part of the cultural fabric of Southern California, decides it's better off somewhere else, that tells you something fundamental has changed. Now, In-N-Out isn't abandoning California completely. They still have hundreds of locations here, and they're still opening new restaurants in the state. But the direction of their long-term strategy has shifted. New expansion is happening faster in places like Texas, Arizona, Nevada, and now Tennessee. California is no longer the center of gravity for a company that was built here. And that matters because In-N-Out represents a specific kind of business. They're not a massive multinational conglomerate trying to squeeze every last dollar out of shareholders. They're a privately held, family-run company with deep roots in the state. If anyone was going to stick it out in California through thick and thin, it should have been them. The fact that they're hedging their bets tells you the environment has become challenging even for businesses with that kind of loyalty and stability. So what exactly is driving this shift? It's not one single thing. It's a combination of pressures that have been building for years, and they're hitting businesses across the board, not just fast food chains. Start with the cost of doing business. California has some of the highest commercial real estate costs in the country, particularly in major metro areas. Rent for retail and restaurant space in cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Diego can be 2 or 3 times what it costs in comparable cities in other states. That alone makes it harder to turn a profit, especially for businesses that operate on thin margins. But real estate is just the beginning. Labor costs in California are significantly higher than in most other states, and not just because of the minimum wage, though that's part of it. California's minimum wage has been climbing steadily, and there are additional local mandates in cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco that push it even higher. For In-N-Out, which is known for paying well above minimum wage anyway, this might not seem like a huge issue, but the ripple effects are real. Higher baseline wages mean higher costs across the entire staffing structure. Benefits, payroll taxes, workers' compensation insurance, all of these scale with wages. And California's workers' comp system is notoriously expensive compared to other states. Businesses here pay some of the highest premiums in the nation, and for a company that employs thousands of people, that adds up fast. Then there's the regulatory environment. California has more regulations governing business operations than almost any other state. Some of these regulations are designed to protect workers, consumers, and the environment, and there's a legitimate case to be made for many of them. But the cumulative effect is a compliance burden that's incredibly difficult to navigate, especially for businesses trying to scale. New environmental standards, new labor laws, new health and safety requirements, these roll out constantly, and each one requires businesses to adapt, retrain staff, update systems, and often hire additional compliance personnel. For a large company with resources, this is manageable, if expensive. For smaller businesses, it can be crippling. And even for a company like In-N-Out, which has the infrastructure to handle complexity, there's a point where the cost-benefit analysis tips in favor of putting resources into states where the regulatory landscape is simpler. Energy costs are another factor that doesn't get talked about enough. California has some of the highest electricity rates in the country. For a restaurant chain that runs refrigeration, grills, fryers, and HVAC systems around the clock, energy is a major operating expense. In some parts of California, commercial electricity rates are more than double what they are in states like Tennessee or Texas. That's not a small difference when you're running hundreds of locations. It affects profitability, and over time, it affects where you choose to invest in new growth. But beyond the numbers, there's something else happening that's harder to quantify, but just as important. There's a perception issue. Businesses are watching other businesses leave, and they're asking themselves whether California still offers the advantages it once did. For decades, California was the place to be if you wanted access to innovation, talent, capital, and markets. The state's economy was so dynamic and so large that the high costs were justified. You paid more, but you got more. That equation is starting to break down. The talent is still here, but it's also in Austin, in Nashville, in Denver, in Raleigh. The capital is global now, and the markets are accessible from anywhere with decent infrastructure and internet. The unique advantages California once offered are less unique than they used to be. And then there's the quality of life calculation. For a long time, California could attract and retain employees because of the weather, the culture, the lifestyle. People were willing to accept higher housing costs and longer commutes because they wanted to live here. That's still true for many people, but it's less universally true than it was a generation ago. Housing affordability has become a crisis that affects not just low-income workers, but middle-class families and even well-paid professionals. The median home price in California is well over twice the national average. Renting isn't much better. For businesses trying to recruit talent, this matters. If your employees can't afford to live near where they work, or if they're spending enormous portions of their income on housing, that affects retention, morale, and productivity. In-N-Out's move to Tennessee isn't happening in a vacuum. It's part of a broader trend that's been accelerating over the past several years. Tesla moved its headquarters to Texas. Hewlett-Packard Enterprise moved to Texas. Oracle moved to Texas. CBRE Group, one of the world's largest commercial real estate firms, moved to Dallas. Charles Schwab moved to Texas. These aren't small startups making opportunistic moves. These are established multi-billion-dollar companies that have deep ties to California, and they're deciding the costs outweigh the benefits. Each move takes jobs, tax revenue, and economic activity out of the state. And each move sends a signal to other companies that maybe it's time to reconsider their own strategies. The political response to this trend has been mixed. Some state leaders have downplayed the significance, pointing out that California's economy is still the largest in the nation and that new businesses are still being created here every day. Both of those things are true. California's GDP is enormous, and the state continues to be a hub for technology, entertainment, agriculture, and trade. But the question isn't whether California's economy is big. The question is whether it's growing in a sustainable way, and whether the policies in place are helping or hurting long-term competitiveness. There's a growing concern among economists and business analysts that California is living off its accumulated advantages, its size, its infrastructure, its established industries, while the underlying conditions for future growth are deteriorating. Other political voices have acknowledged the problem but disagreed sharply on the solutions. Some argue that the state needs to roll back regulations, cut taxes, and make it easier for businesses to operate. Others argue that the real issue is inequality and that the solution is more investment in public services, housing, and infrastructure, funded by higher taxes on corporations and wealthy individuals. This isn't a debate that's going to be resolved quickly, and in the meantime, businesses are making decisions based on the current reality, not on what California might look like in 10 or 20 years if the right policies are implemented. What makes this particularly complicated is that California isn't a monolith. The state's economy is incredibly diverse, and different regions are experiencing very different conditions. The Bay Area tech sector is still attracting massive investment, even as some companies move their headquarters elsewhere. Los Angeles remains a global center for entertainment and trade. The Central Valley is one of the most productive agricultural regions in the world, but there are also parts of the state that are struggling badly. Inland areas have seen population decline, business closures, and rising poverty. The Central Coast and parts of Southern California are dealing with housing crises that make it nearly impossible for working families to stay. And cities like San Francisco are grappling with visible homelessness, retail theft, and public safety concerns that are driving both residents and businesses away. In-N-Out's experience in Oakland is a microcosm of this larger challenge. The crime issues they cited weren't unique to that location. Retail theft, car break-ins, and other property crimes have spiked in several California cities over the past few years, and businesses are feeling the impact. Some retailers have closed stores, others have reduced hours or increased security. The costs of doing business go up when you have to factor in theft, vandalism, and employee safety concerns. And when those costs become unsustainable, businesses make hard choices. In-N-Out chose to close that one location, but the underlying issues that led to that decision are still present in other parts of the state. This brings us to a critical point. The challenges California is facing aren't the result of any single policy or any single administration. They're the result of decades of decisions, trade-offs, and unintended consequences. Housing policy is a perfect example. California's housing crisis didn't happen overnight. It's the result of zoning laws that restrict density, environmental regulations that slow down construction, local opposition to new development, and a tax structure that disincentivizes building. These problems have been building since the 1970s, and they've been exacerbated by population growth and economic expansion. Solving them would require changes at the state, county, and city levels, and it would require political will to override local opposition. So far, that will has been inconsistent at best. The same is true for infrastructure. California's roads, bridges, water systems, and public transit are aging, and in some cases, they're failing. Investment has not kept pace with need, and the costs of catching up are staggering. This affects businesses directly. Congestion increases transportation costs. Water restrictions affect agriculture and industry. Unreliable power grids create risks for businesses that depend on consistent electricity. When a company is deciding where to build its next facility or where to locate its headquarters, infrastructure quality is a major factor. And right now, California is losing ground to states that have invested more aggressively in modern infrastructure. Energy policy is another area where good intentions have led to complex outcomes. California has been a leader in renewable energy and climate policy, and that's made the state a model for environmental action. But the transition to renewable energy has come with costs, including higher electricity rates and grid reliability concerns. The state has experienced rolling blackouts during heat waves, and businesses have had to plan for the possibility of power interruptions. For a restaurant chain like In-N-Out, which depends on refrigeration to keep food safe, that's not a trivial concern. For manufacturers, data centers, and other businesses with high energy needs, it's a serious operational risk. None of this means that California is doomed or that the state's economy is on the verge of collapse. That would be an exaggeration, and it wouldn't reflect the reality on the ground. California still has enormous strengths. It has world-class universities that produce talent and research. It has a culture of innovation and entrepreneurship that's hard to replicate. It has access to global markets through its ports and airports. It has natural resources, from farmland to coastline, that provide economic value and quality of life. And it has a population of nearly 40 million people, which creates a massive consumer market that businesses can't ignore. But those strengths don't guarantee future success. They provide a foundation, but what gets built on that foundation depends on the choices the state makes going forward. And right now, the trajectory is concerning. Population growth has stalled. For the first time in the state's history, California experienced a net population loss in recent years. People are leaving for other states, and fewer people are moving in to replace them. That's a warning sign. It suggests that the balance between opportunity and cost has shifted, and that people are finding better options elsewhere. Business formation is another indicator to watch. While California still leads the nation in absolute numbers of new businesses, the rate of business formation relative to population has slowed. Meanwhile, states like Florida, Texas, and Arizona are seeing faster rates of new business creation. This suggests that the entrepreneurial energy that once gravitated naturally to California is now being distributed more widely across the country. So where does this leave us? In-N-Out's quiet shift away from California is significant, not because it's catastrophic, but because it's emblematic. It represents a loss of confidence, not in California's past, but in its future trajectory. And when you see that same loss of confidence reflected in the decisions of other companies, in the migration patterns of residents, and in the concerns voiced by economists and policy analysts, it becomes clear that California is at a crossroads. The state can continue on its current path and hope that its accumulated advantages are enough to sustain it, or it can make structural changes to address the cost, regulatory, and quality of life issues that are driving people and businesses away. The challenge is that making those changes requires political consensus, and California's political environment is deeply polarized. There's no agreement on what the problems are, let alone what the solutions should be. And in the absence of consensus, the default is incremental adjustment rather than bold reform. That might be enough to prevent a crisis, but it's probably not enough to reverse the trends we're seeing. Companies will continue to diversify their operations away from California. Residents will continue to weigh whether staying is worth the cost. And over time, the state's relative position in the national economy will likely continue to erode, not dramatically, but steadily. In-N-Out's story is still being written. They haven't abandoned California, and they probably never will completely. But their center of gravity has shifted, and that shift reflects a larger reality that Californians need to reckon with. The state that once represented the American dream of opportunity and prosperity is now asking people to make bigger sacrifices for uncertain rewards. And increasingly, people are deciding those sacrifices aren't worth it. That's the real story here, and it's one that deserves serious attention, not because it's sensational, but because it's true.